I've never made a video before, uh, but I think this one makes a lot of sense. I'm gonna do an overview on a deck that I made that I've really been enjoying. Legacy Cycling. Uh, it's a pretty crazy deck, and it's not one that's easy to play. You can see here that one of the big advantages of this deck is it's $150 in paper and $92 in MTGO. So probably the cheapest Legacy deck you can get. I think it's personally the cheapest deck to deck power level ratio in the format. Not to say it's the best deck or anything, but it's very cheap and it's not bad. Um, Basically, how this deck works is you want to get a Fluctuator into play as early as you can, and then the deck is constructed so that you will basically 100% of the time be able to either win this turn or put lethal into play to win next turn, unless you're very low on cards already when you start the loop. It's done a lot with Lotus Petal. So the idea is you play Fluctuator, and then every card in your deck, or every card in your hand is now either a Lotus Petal or another copy of Fluctuator, which helps against removal a lot because if your opponent removes Fluctuator, it doesn't really matter. You just put another one in hand and go off next turn. But how you actually go off is these three cards really, but mainly Drainage Stinger. So what you do is well, technically you kind of just play two Lotus Petals and cast Drainage Stinger, but generally the plan is going to be to cycle Drainage Stinger, um, and then unearth using only one Lotus Petal to get it into play. But either is really completely reasonable. And from there, you just cycle, kill your opponent, which usually happens from like with one card, even with only one card in hand, it's decently likely you can kill your opponent or get him very close to dead. Uh, and big advantage, well, there's two big advantages to this line. First of course being that it wins that turn, unlike Flourishing Fox and Val Manifestation, but it's also much better against removal. If your opponent has removal, then you can just completely ignore it and go off in response. It means you lose one card, which could be relevant, especially if you're low on cards, but unless you're unlucky or you have very few cards in hand when you go for the combo, Stinger should completely ignore removal. Now, you can't always afford to go for a Stinger. Sometimes you get low on cards and you draw into a Battle Manifestation or you haven't discarded a Stinger yet and you have to unearth something. Battle Manifestation is really the second target. You only go for Fox when you're kind of desperate, uh, because, well, really Fox is better, but you have to get it early, which doesn't usually happen. Um, but so yeah, Battle Manifestation, pretty crazy card. It does still beat most removal, and like, you know, if your opponent plows it, you're gonna gain 36 life. It probably gives you enough time to try to go off again with another Battle Manifestation. So the idea here is you can play Val Manifestation, and of course there's always just a line of Val Manifestation pass, or Flourishing Fox pass, once you get into large power. But this deck also includes Footfall Crater, which means you can potentially win immediately. Uh, and oftentimes what Footfall Crater actually means is you just give it trample next turn and win next turn. But if you're in a scenario where it calls for it, you can do a very specific line. In this built in the sideboard, I've played it in the main board before. It's kind of meta dependent. I'm not really deciding exactly where I prefer it. But if you go for Cloud of Fairies and then you unearth the Cloud of Fairies, you untap two lands and spend one land on Footfall Crater on the Blasted Landscape, or the other land you untapped, which is usually Blasted Landscape because you often do with a land drop left, and you can target your big creature and swing for lethal that turn also. Just a lot less consistent that way since it takes more cards. So that's basically the deck. Uh, Sideboard is pretty simple. Uh, just like the most reasonable cycling cards. Visions of Beyond is cool in this deck because it would be in the main board. Well, what it does is it makes your cycling combo a little bit more consistent, especially if you have an extra mana when you go off. But the problem with that is what it also does is it loses to Chalice of the Void, loses to Pyroblast, it loses to a lot of cards this deck is usually quite good against. So you can't really afford to play it in the main board, but one in the sideboard is great. Just for whenever you play against not those cards. And usually they won't bring Pyroblast in anyways. They'll side it out, in fact, so you can afford to play game 2 even against red decks with Pyroblast. Uh, the only other notable card here is Surgical Extraction. Surgical is a very, I mean, your Reanimator matchup is terrible, so you have to play something. So you can play Leyline or Surgical. But Surgical is really good in this deck because in the Reanimator matchup, you can sideboard some or all of your Lotus Petals out, and then when you play Fluctuator, instead of going for a combo, you can just put a bunch of extractions in your hand, and that immediately wins. The Reanimator matchup usually. That's pretty nice. Other than that, sideboard's pretty simple. The land is against Wasteland decks, also against Daze decks. Pretty important to have more lands, although we are a 25, no, 23 land deck. So we're already not terrible against getting to mana. What Daze and Wasteland do, though, are still amazing against the deck because they still slow it down quite a lot. Now, currently this deck is mostly kind of like Doomsday from what I've described, except for it's a lot less disruptive, obviously. I mean, you have your discard that can potentially work, or mainboard disenchant's pretty nice sometimes, but you think like it's probably just like, your opponent plays a cast ball and you lose. But the reason that isn't true is because this card in this deck, Flourishing Fox, that's a 1 mana 4/4, 5/5, 6/6, somewhere in that range. This card in the deck is a 2 mana 7/4, 8/4. These give those things trample, and Unearth brings them back, and Jonas Sneaker can still go in for damage. So this deck has a completely reasonable fair plan where you just like play one of these, cycle a bunch, and kill your opponent. And the nice part that is that sometimes your opponent there's two really nice parts about that. The first of which being if you can kill your opponent that way game 1 and not even show them a Fluctuator, which you will try to do if you're in a spot to do it. What that means is that they won't bring in hate for your Fluctuator, and it might even Force is not that good against this deck, the aggro deck, so you can probably more aggressively mulligan to a Fluctuator hand. But probably even more importantly is if your opponent does see Fluctuator game 1 and they bring in a ton of hate for Fluctuator, then you just go turn on Flourishing Fox, and they probably lose because let's say you go for the Drain Stinger line game 1 and kill them on turn 2, and they try to plow your Stinger and you win anyways. They're boarding out the plows, right? So Flourishing Fox in that kind of game will oftentimes just win when it resolves. You don't need the Fluctuators. Your opponent can force Fluctuator, and oftentimes they're forced to use their action on these guys, and your Fluctuator can win. Um, the deck is very simple on paper and can sometimes be very complicated to actually play. I've played a lot of the deck now. I feel pretty confident with my ability to play it. Uh, and I have a specific game here that I'm gonna show, or a match that I want to kind of go through and explain some things about it. Uh, so basically, how this went was I had a fast Fluctuator hand. This hand is probably a turn 2 win, so I'm keeping it, of course. And I start setting up for the turn 2 win, and my opponent has blue, so I think, oh, I'll go for a slower start. I get wastelanded and punished. No, now that I can see their hand, it would have been better to just go for the win, of course. But I end up going for a win a little bit later in the game because they have wasteland, but they don't have anything for it, and I can just cycle through here I get the Stinger in play eventually, and it just wins the game on the spot. This would have been a turn to win if I went for it, but since I saw blue lands, I decided that I should probably wait. So this game, this is the next game in the match. My opponent is prepared for my combo. They saw the unearth, so they have surgical extraction, force of will. Like this Beseju, this hand is not losing to Turbo Fluctuator. Um, but I don't have a Turbo Fluctuator hand this time because I know they're going to bring all these cards in. I'm not going to keep the hand without force of will. So what I do is I just go for a Flourishing Fox and another Flourishing Fox. They get an Uro. And I try to exile their Urgo. They have a Daze, and this is where like the deck really shines. Is my opponent was never going to lose to the combo in this game. My opponent also is going to get an Uro next turn. My opponent also wastelanded me. They had surgical extraction, force of will, Uro, wasteland, right? And it doesn't matter. They can play out their true name nemesis, play out their Uro. They have Force of Will backup. They don't get an opportunity to use Force of Will this entire game. Our Flourishing Foxes, they're 4/4s, they're 5/4s, and we just swing in. We're an aggro deck now. They have they have to block because they're going to be dead. Hull Breacher's a great card against their deck, but when you're attacking for 16 power, then Hull Breacher is a lot less of a good card against our deck. And yeah, I'm able just to force through a win, even through Uro, even through surgical extraction, even through force of will. I just win by attacking with 2/5/5s and a 6/4. And that's like really the power of the deck is you can you can just win with either half of the deck, and your opponent both has to be prepared for both halves of the decks, and usually won't be prepared for both halves. If this deck was, a well-known meta force, it would be a lot worse because your opponent would know to keep the surgical extractions out. Surgical extractions are not good against this deck. The cards we have in our deck that care about surgical extraction are Val Manifestation to a very small degree and Unearth, which it's very easy to play around surgical extraction. We can usually win without using our graveyard just by a double Lotus Petal, Drain a Stinger, or Battle Manifestation. Um, so yeah, the biggest strength of this deck is that no one knows how to play against it. Oftentimes, people will bring in the craziest cards, or like keep hands that are like land, force of vigor, nothing, and then they just lose to the rest of our deck. And I think it's a very cool deck. The best thing about this deck, it's made it a lot better. I played this deck before the initiative existed, but I've played it more now after. This deck cannot possibly lose against initiative if you play correctly and aren't incredibly unlucky. They have no interaction for your deck. I mean, they have uh, Chalice with the Void sometimes, but Chalice with the Void is not good against this deck. Like, your opponent plays a Chalice with the Void and, okay, uh, on 0, shuts off 4 cards in the deck. You just wait a turn and combo with an extra land. Still works. Or play it on 1. Okay, you shut off Unearth. Doesn't matter. Lotus Petal, Drain a Stinger. So Chalice with the Void doesn't shut off the deck at all. It might buy a turn if they play it on the right number, but oftentimes Chalice on 0 is pretty rough for the decks that are playing Chalice themselves. So Chalice is not good against this deck. Blood Moon, we actively prefer Blood Moons in play most of the time. Because it makes their lands enter untapped, which they don't currently. I've before, kept a hand that wins on turn 3. My opponent turn 2 or turn 1's Blood Moon. And it's like, okay, now my hand wins on turn 2. It just literally got better. My opponent played Blood Moon. Uh, it's very, very difficult to hit out this deck. Your opponent plays like a Aetherthorn Canonist. That's not going to do anything. Uh, or Rule of Law. Rule of Law, I mean, it's not the Rule of Law of the played card. Deafening Silence, I guess, is a more reasonable. Uh, Deafening Silence here, we play Fluctuator and pass, and then next turn we win. So Deafening Silence will buy somewhere between 1 turn and, I mean, it'll buy 2 turns sometimes. It makes the interaction better. It makes it hard to win through interaction, of course. But, like, this deck is not going to get hit out. Land on the Void makes our combo slightly less consistent, but that's all it does. Endurance is maybe the best greater hit against this deck because when we know about it, it's easy to play around, but we might play into endurance, and also endurance happens to be very good against Val manifestation in general, and also it's just decent against our fair plan. But really, I mean, even endurance is not amazing against our deck. It's a lot better against the fair plan, but once we go for the combo, we get Dragon Stinger in play, then it's over. Um, and Mana Leak, sorry, Memory Leak is a more recent addition to the deck. I wasn't playing with it for a long time. I thought it was too overcost. I thought it was too costly, too slow. But it is just a one cycler. So what you can do is just cycle it for one, and it's not too slow because one mana cantrips are never too slow. Uh, and when you do get into a late game, especially like your opponent plays a blue land, and you have like two memory leaks in hand, then you're like, okay, I guess I'm just playing a memory leak game. So you can even if you have a turn two Fluctuator win, it's usually not worth it. Just memory leak turn three or turn four maybe. Take their Force of Will, memory leak again, take their next Force of Will, and most of the slow blue decks can't stop you. So the slow blue decks are pretty reasonable matchups. I would say they're around 50-50. Uh, although of course a lot of that just comes from no one knows how to play against this deck. Against an experienced blue deck pilot against a blue deck pilot who's experienced against this deck, then it's probably a lot more like 45-55 in the blue deck's favor. But in my experience, I probably win about half the blue matchups, maybe a little bit more, but I play on Cockatrice, so my opponents I don't think are usually the highest caliber. Uh, and against like initiative or death and taxes, stuff like that, the decks relying on removal, those are basically unlosable. Lands, I mean, they have to basically fast combo us out. Our combo is faster, but they do have like Bajuka Bog, Endurance sometimes. So they have a little bit more disruption for us than we do. So Lands is favored, um, probably like 60-40, but something like Initiative, which happens to be a pretty big meta player right now, is like I want to say 80-20. Like you will lose that matchup. It's probably better than that. You will lose that matchup so incredibly rarely. They just don't have tools against your combo in general. There's nothing they can do. So, this deck maybe sounds, wow, it's insane. It's good against slow blue decks. It's good against the best, or well, maybe the most played, depends, maybe second most played deck in the format. But then you run into the problem. Uh, Against well, there's two specific types of decks. The rest of the type of decks in the format really that it's not good against at all, which is fast combo and Delver or tempo. Um, Delver is actually not a terrible matchup. You may think it's like unwinnable, like they have Force of Will and Wasteland, which are both quite good against this deck. But Delver also doesn't have anything that removes a Val manifestation. So a lot of times against Delver, your goal is just to get a Val manifestation to play, and they just can't win. But even if that doesn't work, you can always go for a Fluctuator, and they usually won't have interaction for it if you can hit Resolve, which of course not easy. Force Days, Wasteland. Uh, I'm not saying Delver is a good matchup at all, but Delver is probably only like 45-55 in their favor. Uh, Something like Death Shadow though, where they have Thoughtseize added onto the list. Thoughtseize is a very good card against this deck, often Hymnotorac. Dreadnought often is better against this deck because they have a fast combo and usually play Thoughtseize. Well, Thoughtseize Dreadnought is pretty terrible matchup for this deck. Something like that. Those are approaching the point where I don't think I will usually win. Like maybe it's like 70-30, something like that. They're pretty bad. And then fast combo is very interesting. If it's grave based off, if it's reanimator specifically, pretty much, if it's something that loses to surgical extraction in the sideboard, I think we're actually pretty much even. I mean, your deck is slower than theirs, but not by that much. I mean, your deck will, on average, probably win faster than theirs, but will go off slower. Um, well, it's important for destroying the animate deads in that matchup. You want to play at the lowest pedal so they can't be discarded because fast one is the most important thing. And yeah, I mentioned this earlier, but you board out some number of lotus petals and board into surgical extraction. And your plan in that matchup is just always keep it hand with like fast fluctuator or surgical, and hope they can beat surgical because fluctuator becomes three more surgicals. And you always have to fair plan to beat their hard casting griefs and stuff. Um, so yeah, Reanimator is not a bad matchup. It's not a good matchup. I want to say it's 50-50, somewhere in there. But other fast combo decks with Thoughtseize, Doomsday. Doomsday is a pretty abysmal matchup also. Probably similar to Death Shadow, where you're actually probably faster than Doomsday. Um, but it doesn't matter because they have Daze Force and Thoughtseize, which are all amazing against your deck. Um, so in the Doomsday matchup, you really have to rely on like them keeping a either them keeping a fast uninteractive hand you can just goldfish, or them keeping a really slow controlling hand without a clock at all, and you can get the backup plan working. Uh, so this is basically the type of deck that oftentimes, whether you win or lose, it's just gonna be determined by what you match up against. I would say about 50% of the time, if you just know what I was playing against, I could tell you how the match was going to end, which is not for everyone. Um, but it does mean that you can try and modify it to beat those decks a lot. Like uh, in the sideboard here, we have a Sicken, 3 Easy Prey, and a Suffocating Fumes. That's basically for Delver, all of those cards. I mean, you can play Sicken to kill Thalia or whatever, but this deck's not really that worried about Thalia. It just slows you down by like 1 turn, 1.5 turns at worst, or Visions of Gaunt or something. Um, which you shouldn't do against Thalia decks in the first place, but if you do for some reason. Uh, so this package here means you can kind of just play against a Delver as a control deck. Uh, just like kill their thing, kill 2 of their things. I mean, Murktide is of course the scariest card against them, against you when they're playing. Your goal is kind of force them to a position where they have to tap out for Murktide, and they've had to interact with your fair plan, and then you just land a Fluctuator and kill them. Or you can memory leak Murktide. That's quite good. Oh, part of this that you may not realize is it is also Grave Hate, which is pretty great against Reanimator. I mean, it's very slow, but it is Grave Hate. Another pretty terrible matchup, similar vein as Doomsday, is like the slower Storm decks. Uh, they're quite difficult to fast combo out usually, but not quite as bad as like Doomsday, since they usually lack days. So you might be able to get a game on them by fast combo. Uh, but because of the rise of initiative, um, which happens to be pretty good against a lot of the faster combo decks because of all the mainboard hate that we happen to dodge, those decks are a lot less popular. So this deck is basically at the current time trying to prey on the decks that are pushing the decks that are good against this deck out of their format. It's a win-win situation. Uh, and it's not bad. I 5-0'd a few times. I mean, when you play 70 games and you 5-0 3 times, that's not like an impressive record, but it also is a proof of concept. And this build of the deck is not perfect. Um, yeah, that's what I have to say on the deck. I'm hoping that I can record some videos of me actually playing. I figure it's be a good thing to start uh with, just like so people know what the deck is, what it does, why it's good, and maybe I can make some videos actually playing it and maybe explaining more in depth how I play it. Because if you were just to pick this deck up without any explanations, you would probably just 0-5. I mean, I've seen it happen. I've tried to help people play this. I've tried to convince people to play this deck before, and they tell me it's terrible. But then I play against them and I beat them, and It's not an easy deck to play. So yeah, until I make another video, bye.